The moon hung like a sliver of bone over the Burgundy countryside, casting barely enough light to distinguish the rows of grapevines from the darker patches of forest that hemmed them in. Marcel Rousseau crouched in the damp earth between two rows of vines, his breath forming small clouds in the October air of 1943. His bicycle lay on its side a few meters away, the front wheel still spinning slowly from where he had thrown it down moments before. The metal frame gleamed dully in the starlight, one of thousands of bicycles that had become the lifeblood of the French resistance, the silent horses of an underground army. He pressed his ear closer to the cold rail of the train track that cut through the vineyard like a scar. The vibration was unmistakable now, growing stronger with each passing second. The ammunition train was coming right on schedule. Marcel allowed himself a brief smile. The Germans were nothing if not punctual, even when that punctuality would be their undoing. Behind him, hidden among the vines, 11 other resistance fighters waited. He could see the outline of Sophie Mercier's blonde hair, barely concealed beneath a dark scarf. She had insisted on coming despite his protests, and now he was glad for it. Her steady hands and sharper mind had saved them more than once. Further back, near the tree line, he could make out the bulky form of Henri Dubois, the railway worker whose information had made this entire operation possible. Henri knew every train schedule, every shipment, every weak point in the German logistics network that moved through their region like a steel snake devouring French resources and returning nothing but occupation and death. The plan was audacious to the point of madness, which was precisely why it might work. The Germans expected sabotage, certainly. They posted guards, conducted patrols, executed suspected resistance members in public squares as warnings. But they expected bombs on the tracks, cut telegraph lines, perhaps an ambush with stolen weapons. They did not expect 12 people on bicycles to hijack an entire ammunition train carrying supplies destined for the Atlantic Wall fortifications. Marcel rose slowly, keeping low, and made his way back to where the others waited. Sophie met his eyes in the darkness, and he saw his own fear and determination reflected there. They had known each other since childhood, had played in these same vineyards when they were still innocent enough to believe the world was a safe place. That innocence had died on a June morning in 1940 when the Germans marched into Paris. Now they were soldiers in a war fought with bicycles and stolen explosives, with forged papers and whispered intelligence. 5 minutes, Marcel whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves in the night wind. Everyone to positions. Remember, timing is everything. If we miss our window, we abort and scatter. No heroics, no improvisation. Understood? Heads nodded in the darkness. These were not professional soldiers. They were a shopkeeper, a teacher, a seamstress, 2 farmers, a priest, a factory worker, a nurse, and a former policeman who had refused to collaborate with Vichy authorities. Henri, their inside man, was risking the most. If the operation failed and he was identified, the Gestapo would not simply execute him. They would take their time, extracting every name, every safe house, every contact, before finally granting him the mercy of death. Among them was also young Antoine Chastain, barely 18, who had begged to join after the Germans shot his father for the crime of having a radio. Marcel had his doubts about the boy. Antoine had the fire of revenge burning in his eyes, but fire could blind as easily as illuminate. In operations like this, cold calculation mattered more than hot passion. And there was Luc Fontaine, the only one among them who troubled Marcel's sleep. Luc had appeared 3 months ago, claiming to have escaped from a labor camp in Germany. His story checked out. His hatred of the Germans seemed genuine. His willingness to fight was unquestionable. but something about the man set Marcel's instincts on edge. Perhaps it was the way Luc's eyes were always watching, always calculating, or perhaps Marcel was simply becoming paranoid, seeing betrayal in every shadow. In the resistance, paranoia kept you alive, but it could also paralyze you when action was needed. The group split up now, moving to their assigned positions with practiced stealth. Marcel and Sophie headed north along the track, where the train would have to slow for a curve. Henri moved to the switching station a kilometre down the line, where he would perform the most crucial and dangerous part of the operation. The others spread out in teams of 2, each with their bicycles and specific tasks. The French resistance had learned to love bicycles out of necessity. When the Germans confiscated automobiles and rationed fuel to starvation levels, bicycles became the only means of rapid transportation available to ordinary French citizens. They were too common to be suspicious, too simple to be controlled. A person on a bicycle could cover 60 kilometers in a night, carrying messages, weapons or explosives hidden in saddlebags or beneath loads of vegetables. The Germans' checkpoints could stop and search every car, but they could not stop every bicycle without bringing the entire civilian infrastructure to a halt. This operation would push the bicycle's utility to its absolute limit. The plan called for the resistance fighters to board the ammunition train while it was moving at reduced speed through the curve, to overpower the guards using surprise and numbers rather than firepower, and then to hijack the entire train using Henri's knowledge of the railway system. Once they had control, they would reroute it to a remote stretch of track where other resistance cells were waiting to unload the ammunition before destroying the train and disappearing into the countryside on their bicycles. The ammunition would be hidden, distributed to resistance networks throughout the region, and used to arm the Maquis fighters in the hills and forests. It was the kind of plan that sounded like a fairy tale when spoken aloud, which was precisely why Marcel had kept the full details from most of the participants until the last moment. Only Sophie, Henri, and 2 others knew the complete picture. The rest knew their individual tasks and nothing more. If someone was captured, they could only betray what they knew. Marcel and Sophie reached their position and concealed themselves behind an old stone wall that bordered the track. Their bicycles were hidden in a drainage culvert nearby, ready for the escape. Sophie checked the Sten gun concealed beneath her coat, a crude British weapon dropped by parachute 2 months earlier. It was ugly, prone to jamming, and notoriously inaccurate, but it fired bullets, and that made it precious beyond gold. "Are you frightened?" Sophie whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "Terrified," Marcel admitted. There was no point in lying to her. She could always see through him anyway. "Good. The day we stop being frightened is the day we become careless." She paused, then added, "After this, maybe we can finally leave. Go to London, join de Gaulle's people, do something more than hide in shadows and hope the Germans don't find us." Marcel wanted to agree, to promise her they would survive this night and find a way to England, to fight openly instead of skulking through the darkness. But he had made too many promises he could not keep. Instead, he simply took her hand and squeezed it gently. The vibration in the rails became a distant rumble, then a growing thunder. The train appeared around the bend, a dark serpent of steel sliding through the night. Marcel counted the cars, his heart sinking as he realized the train was longer than Henri had reported. 12 boxcars instead of 8, which meant more guards, more complications, more chances for disaster. But there was no turning back now. The signal lantern flashed 3 times from the woods to the east, confirming that everyone was in position. Marcel raised his own lantern and flashed the acknowledgement. The die was cast. The locomotive engineer began applying the brakes as the train approached the curve, just as Henri had predicted. The wheels screamed against the rails, and the entire train shuddered as it decelerated. This was the moment. Marcel and Sophie broke from cover, running parallel to the train, their legs pumping as they matched its speed. The hard-packed dirt beside the tracks made for treacherous footing in the darkness, and Marcel nearly stumbled over a half-buried stone. Ahead, he saw other shadows converging on the train from both sides. The plan called for them to board the rear cars simultaneously, overwhelming any guards stationed there before working their way forward. The locomotive and first two cars would be Henri's responsibility once they reached the switching station. Marcel grabbed for a ladder rung on the side of a boxcar, his fingers closing on cold metal. He hauled himself up, muscles burning from the effort of matching the train's speed while climbing. Sophie was right behind him, lighter and more agile. They reached the top of the boxcar and crouched low, the wind whipping at their clothes as the train continued its journey. Below them, Marcel could hear shouts in German. The guards had spotted the boarders. Gunfire cracked through the night, muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. Someone screamed, a high, agonized sound that cut through the rumble of the train. Marcel prayed it was not one of their people, knowing it probably was. He crawled forward across the top of the boxcar, Sophie following. They reached the end and prepared to jump the gap to the next car. This was the dangerous part. If they mistimed the jump, they would fall between the cars and be crushed beneath the wheels. Marcel did not let himself think about it. He simply jumped, his boots hitting the roof of the next car with a solid thump. Sophie landed beside him a second later, her face pale, but determined in the moonlight. More gunfire erupted from the rear of the train. Through the darkness, Marcel could see muzzle flashes and the dark shapes of men fighting. He had to trust that the others could handle themselves. His job was to reach the locomotive. They crossed 3 more cars, the train now fully into the curve and moving at barely 30 kilometers per hour. Perfect. At this speed, they could maintain control when they took over. Any faster, and the risk of derailment would be too great. Marcel dropped down between 2 cars, landing on the coupling platform. A German guard stood there, a young man no older than Antoine, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The guard's eyes went wide with shock as Marcel materialized out of the darkness. For a frozen moment, they stared at each other. 2 young men caught in a war neither had asked for. Then training overcame hesitation. The guard fumbled for his rifle. Marcel pulled the knife from his belt and lunged forward. The blade caught the guard in the throat, and hot blood sprayed across Marcel's hand. The guard made a wet, choking sound and collapsed. Marcel eased him down to prevent the body from falling onto the tracks and alerting others. Sophie landed beside him, saw the dead guard, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. This was war, and war made murderers of them all, willing or not. They moved to the next car and the next. At each coupling they encountered guards. Most never saw them coming. A few managed to raise the alarm or fire their weapons before being silenced. By the 5th car, Marcel's hands were shaking, and his clothes were soaked with other men's blood. He had killed 4 people tonight, 4 German boys who were probably conscripts like the young men of France, fighting because their government demanded it. But he could not afford mercy, could not afford doubt. The ammunition on this train would be used to kill Allied soldiers when the invasion came. Everyone knew it was coming, the great liberation that would sweep the Germans back across the Rhine. Every bullet they stole tonight was one less bullet fired at the Americans or British when they landed. That was the calculus of resistance, the cold mathematics of survival. They reached the car directly behind the locomotive. Through the connecting door's window, Marcel could see into the tender car where coal was stored. 2 guards stood there, alert and armed with submachine guns. These were not half-trained boys, but hardened soldiers, probably veterans of the Eastern Front sent west to recover from wounds or as a reward for service. Marcel signalled Sophie to wait. They needed a distraction, something to draw the guards' attention. As if summoned by his thought, an explosion rocked the rear of the train. Someone had used grenades, either in desperation or opportunity. The two guards in the tender car turned to look back, hands tightening on their weapons. Marcel did not waste the opening. He kicked open the door and rushed in, Sophie right behind him. The first guard died before he could turn around, Sophie's Sten gun stitching a line across his back. The second managed to get his weapon up, and bullets whined past Marcel's head, so close he felt the wind of their passage. He threw himself forward, tackling the guard. They went down in a tangle of limbs among the coal. The guard was stronger, better trained, and he quickly gained the upper hand, his hands closing around Marcel's throat. Sophie could not fire without hitting Marcel. Instead, she swung the Sten gun like a club, the metal stock connecting with the guard's skull with a sickening crack. The guard went limp. Sophie hit him twice more to be certain, then pulled Marcel to his feet. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled fear. Marcel shook his head, unable to speak, his throat bruised from the guard's grip. They had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. They needed to take the locomotive itself. The door to the locomotive cab was locked from inside. Marcel pounded on it with his fist, while Sophie covered the approach from the rear. Through the small window he could see the engineer and fireman, both civilians in railway uniforms. Good. They might not resist as fanatically as soldiers. "Open up!" Marcel shouted in French. "We're the resistance. Open the door or we blow it open and you with it." It was a bluff. They had no explosives with them. But the men inside did not know that. The fireman looked terrified. The engineer, an older man with a weathered face, looked calculating. He was weighing his options, considering whether cooperation or resistance offered better odds of survival. The calculation shifted when gunfire erupted from directly behind the locomotive. Henry had reached the switching station and was making his move. The engineer could see what was happening, could understand that his train was being taken whether he cooperated or not. The door unlocked with a click. Marcel pushed inside, Sophie following. The heat from the firebox was overwhelming after the cold night air. The engineer raised his hands slowly, his face carefully neutral. "We don't want to hurt you," Marcel said, which was partially true. "Keep the train moving at this speed. Do what we say, and you'll live through the night." "And if I refuse?" the engineer asked. He had a Parisian accent, educated, a career railwayman who had probably been doing this job since before the war. "Then my friend shoots you, and I drive the train myself. I'll probably crash it and kill us all, but at least the Germans won't get their ammunition." Marcel kept his voice steady, matter of fact. The engineer needed to believe he meant every word. The engineer studied Marcel's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll cooperate, but the Germans will hunt you for this. They'll burn villages, execute hostages. You know what they do?" "I know," Marcel said quietly. "We all know. We do it anyway." Sophie moved to the fireman, a young man who was trembling so badly he could barely stand. She spoke to him quietly, gently, reassuring him that he would not be harmed if he obeyed. The fireman nodded rapidly, eager to please, eager to survive. A figure appeared at the locomotive door. Marcel spun, raising his pistol, then relaxed as he recognized Antoine. The young man was grinning wildly, his face streaked with soot and blood. "We have the rear cars secured," Antoine reported, his voice high with excitement and adrenaline. 6 guards dead, 2 wounded and surrendered. Paul took a bullet in the leg, but he'll live. No sign of pursuit yet. Where's Luc? Marcel asked. He had not seen the man during the fighting. Antoine's grin faltered. I don't know. I lost sight of him after we boarded. He was supposed to be with Jean-Claude's team. An uneasy feeling settled in Marcel's stomach, but there was no time to investigate now. They were committed. The train continued rolling through the darkness, and ahead, Henri would be throwing the switch that would divert them onto an abandoned siding that ran through the hills to an old quarry. The other resistance cells would be waiting there with trucks they had stolen or borrowed from farms, ready to unload the ammunition. "Get back and organize the others," Marcel ordered Antoine. "Post guards at every car. If the engineer or fireman try anything, kill them. No warnings, no second chances." Antoine nodded and disappeared back into the darkness. Sophie moved to the window, peering out at the night rushing past. "Do you think we'll actually pull this off?" she asked. Marcel opened his mouth to answer when the world exploded into chaos. The locomotive lurched violently to one side, throwing everyone against the walls. The scream of tortured metal filled the air as the train shuddered and swayed. For a heart-stopping moment, Marcel thought they were derailing. Then the locomotive steadied, still upright, still moving, but something was terribly wrong. The engineer was on his feet, eyes wide. Someone threw the emergency brakes. The rear cars, they're trying to separate from the locomotive. Marcel understood immediately. They had missed a guard, or someone had radioed ahead, or, worst of all, there was a traitor among them. Someone was trying to stop the hijacking by splitting the train. "Can you override it?" Marcel demanded. The engineer shook his head. "Not from here. Someone has to manually release the brakes on the rear section. If we keep pulling, we'll rip the couplings apart." Sophie was already moving. "I'll go. Stay here and keep these two under control." "It's too dangerous," Marcel protested, but she was already out the door, climbing onto the tender car's roof. He watched her silhouette disappear into the darkness, his heart in his throat. The locomotive continued to slow despite the engineer's efforts. Behind them, the rear cars were dragging like an anchor. They were losing momentum, and if they stopped here, in the middle of nowhere with half the operation incomplete, they would be sitting ducks when German reinforcements arrived. Minutes crawled past like hours. Marcel kept his pistol trained on the engineer and fireman, but his mind was with Sophie, imagining a dozen disasters. The gunfire had stopped, which could mean the immediate threat was over, or that everyone was dead. He had no way of knowing. Then the resistance in the train's movement suddenly ceased. The locomotive surged forward, free of whatever had been holding it back. The engineer quickly adjusted the throttle, bringing them back to the proper speed. They were moving again, but at what cost? Sophie reappeared 10 minutes later, climbing back into the locomotive cab. Her face was grim, and there was fresh blood on her hands that Marcel prayed was not her own. "It was Luc," she said without preamble. "He tried to separate the cars, probably hoping to strand us and signal the Germans. Henri's people caught him. He's dead now." Marcel felt a surge of vindication mixed with bitter regret. His instincts had been right, but he had not acted on them quickly enough. How much of their planning had Luc reported to the Germans? How many of their safe houses were compromised? How many other operations were at risk? "Did he say anything before he died?" Marcel asked. Sophie shook her head. "Henri didn't give him the chance, pushed him off the moving train. The fall broke his neck." It was a brutal end, but probably kinder than what the man deserved. If Luc had been a German agent all along, he had sent how many resistance fighters to torture and death? The Gestapo did not simply execute captured resistance members. They questioned them first, using methods that made strong men weep and beg for death. The train rolled on through the night, and slowly Marcel's racing heart began to calm. They had overcome the sabotage attempt. they still controlled the train. Ahead, the switching station appeared out of the darkness, a small building lit by a single lamp. Henri stood beside the track, his hand on the lever that would divert them onto the siding. As they approached, Henri pulled the lever. Marcel felt the train shift beneath him as the wheels followed the diverging rails. They were off the main line now, committed fully to the operation. There would be no easy way back, no simple escape if things went wrong. The abandoned siding led through increasingly rough terrain. The tracks here had not been maintained since before the war, and the ride became progressively rougher. The engineer worked the controls carefully, keeping their speed low enough to avoid derailment, but high enough to maintain momentum up the gradual incline. 20 minutes later, they rounded a final curve, and the quarry opened up before them like a vast crater in the earth. Scattered across the quarry floor were dozens of figures and vehicles, all showing dimmed lights as agreed upon. The other resistance cells had assembled, along with farmers and townspeople who had volunteered for the dangerous work of unloading and transporting the ammunition. Marcel felt a surge of pride and hope. This was what resistance looked like, not grand battles or glorious charges, but ordinary people risking everything to strike back against occupation, to prove that France was not conquered, merely occupied, and that occupation could be contested, resisted, undermined. The engineer brought the train to a halt with professional smoothness. Marcel kept his weapon on the man, but his respect for him had grown. The engineer had done his job competently, despite being held at gunpoint, and that took a special kind of courage. "You can go," Marcel told him. "Take your firemen, walk back to the main line, and report the train stolen. Tell them whatever you want. We'll be long gone before they arrive." The engineer studied him for a moment. "You're just kids," he said finally. "Playing at war, thinking you're making a difference. The Germans will crush you. They always do." "Maybe," Marcel agreed. "But while they're crushing us, they can't focus entirely on the Russians or prepare for the invasion. We're a distraction, a thorn in their side. Sometimes that's enough." The engineer shook his head but said nothing more. He and his firemen climbed down from the locomotive and disappeared into the darkness. Marcel watched them go, wondering if they would indeed report to the Germans or simply vanish into the countryside, claiming to have been overpowered and knowing nothing. Outside, the unloading had already begun. The resistance fighters had pried open the boxcar doors, revealing crate after crate of ammunition, grenades, mortar shells, and small arms. A fortune in weapons, enough to arm several Maquis groups for months of operations. The volunteers formed human chains, passing crates from the train to the waiting trucks with practiced efficiency. Sophie appeared at Marcel's side, her face showing exhaustion. "We lost 3 people tonight," she reported quietly. "Paul with the leg wound will probably survive if we can get him to a doctor. The others died quickly." 3 lives for a train full of ammunition. Was it a fair trade? Marcel did not know, could not know. Mathematics did not apply to human lives. Each death was a world ended, dreams unfulfilled, families destroyed. But what was the alternative? To do nothing? To let the Germans digest France at their leisure? To wait passively for liberation that might never come? "We honor them by making this count," Marcel said. "Every bullet we take tonight is used against the Germans. No waste, no hoarding. The Maquis in the Vosges, the urban cells in Lyon, the saboteurs in Marseille, they all get their share. We spread it around so if one cache is discovered, we don't lose everything." Sophie nodded. "Henri is already organizing the distribution. He has contacts throughout the region. By dawn, this ammunition will be scattered across 50 different hiding spots." The unloading continued through the night with military precision. These were people who had learned to work in darkness, to accomplish complex tasks silently and swiftly, always aware that discovery meant death. Marcel moved among them, offering encouragement, helping where needed, his bicycle leaning against a quarry wall nearby, ready for the escape that would come with dawn. As the eastern sky began to lighten from black to grey, the last crates were loaded onto trucks. The vehicles departed in different directions, each following routes carefully planned to avoid German checkpoints and patrols. The train sat empty now, a hollow steel shell that had served its purpose. Henri approached Marcel, his railway worker's cap pushed back on his head, his face showing the strain of the night's work. "We need to destroy it now," Henri said. "Can't leave evidence of where it stopped or how it was unloaded." Marcel nodded. They had brought explosives for exactly this purpose, dynamite stolen from a construction site, and shaped charges made from instructions dropped by British agents. The demolition team went to work, placing charges at key structural points along the train. They were thorough, professional, taking no chances. When the charges were set, everyone withdrew to a safe distance. Marcel looked at the train one last time, this German machine they had conquered with bicycles and courage. Then he nodded to the demolition expert, an old miner named Georges, who knew explosives the way other men knew wine. Georges twisted the detonator handle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world turned white, and thunder rolled across the quarry. The explosion was enormous, far larger than Marcel had expected. The train disintegrated in a ball of flame and shrapnel. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition they had missed cooked off in the inferno. The blast wave knocked Marcel off his feet, and debris rained down around them. When his ears stopped ringing and his vision cleared, he saw that the train was completely destroyed. Nothing remained but twisted metal and burning wreckage. The Germans would find it eventually, but they would find no clues, no evidence pointing to any specific resistance cell or method of operation. "Time to go," Sophie said, pulling Marcel to his feet. "The explosion will bring patrols. We need to be ghosts before they arrive." The resistance fighters dispersed in all directions, each heading to different safe houses and hiding spots. The plan called for them to lie low for at least a week, changing locations frequently, avoiding contact with each other, until the German response settled into routine patterns. Marcel and Sophie retrieved their bicycles and began the long ride back to Dijon. The morning was beautiful, crisp and clear, with autumn colours just beginning to touch the leaves. Birds sang in the trees, unaware or uncaring that men had killed each other nearby. The normalcy of it all felt surreal after the violence of the night. They rode in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts. Marcel kept replaying the operation in his mind, analysing what had worked and what had gone wrong. They had succeeded, but barely. If Luc had been more subtle, if Henri had not acted so decisively, if any one of a dozen small things had gone differently, they would all be dead or captured. "Do you think it was worth it?" Sophie asked as they stopped to rest beside a stream, their bicycles leaning against an old stone bridge. Marcel considered the question seriously. 3 of their people dead, an unknown number of German soldiers killed, a traitor exposed, a train destroyed, enough ammunition captured to wage months of resistance operations. He thought of the young German guard he had killed, the first man whose throat he had cut. The boy had probably had a mother waiting for letters, a sweetheart back in Bavaria or Prussia, dreams of surviving the war and going home. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Ask me again when the war is over, if we're still alive to ask questions." They continued their journey, 2 ordinary people on bicycles, indistinguishable from thousands of others travelling the roads of occupied France. No one who passed them would guess what they had done, what they carried in their memories. That anonymity was their greatest weapon and their heaviest burden. By midday they reached the outskirts of Dijon. Here they would separate, going to different safe houses, becoming different people with different names and different lives. The resistance required constant transformation, constant reinvention. Today, Marcel was a wine merchant's assistant. Tomorrow, he might be a factory worker or a farmer's son. Identity was fluid, truth was negotiable, and only the fight remained constant. After the war, Sophie said as they prepared to part ways, will we even remember who we really are? Marcel had no answer for that. He suspected the war had already changed them so fundamentally that their pre-war selves were gone forever, casualties as surely as the dead they left behind. But he smiled and squeezed her hand, offering comfort he did not feel. We'll find out together, he said. That's all anyone can promise. She nodded, climbed back onto her bicycle, and rode away toward the old quarter of the city. Marcel watched her go, wondering if he would see her again, if either of them would survive long enough to discover whether their sacrifice had meaning or was merely another footnote in history's long ledger of violence. He turned his own bicycle toward the warehouse district, where his current safe house waited. As he rode, he began the mental process of becoming someone else, shedding Marcel Rousseau like a snake shedding skin. By the time he arrived at the warehouse, he would be Claude Arnaud, a simple labourer with no connection to the resistance, no knowledge of hijacked trains or exploded ammunition, but deep in his mind, in a place the Germans could not reach even with their torture and their threats, he would remember. He would remember the night 12 people on bicycles had stolen a German ammunition train and struck a blow for France's honour and freedom. He would remember his fallen comrades and the enemies he had killed. He would carry those memories like sacred relics, proof that resistance was possible, that occupation could be contested, that courage still existed in the world. The bicycle carried him forward into an uncertain future, its wheels turning endlessly on roads that led through darkness toward a distant hope of liberation. Behind him, smoke still rose from the quarry where the train burned. Ahead, the war continued, vast and terrible and seemingly endless. But for one night, in one small corner of occupied France, 12 people had proven that the impossible was merely the improbable accomplished through desperation and will. And that would have to be enough, because it was all they had. The warehouse smelled of dust and motor oil, familiar scents that Marcel had come to associate with temporary safety. He locked his bicycle in the corner behind a stack of empty crates, covering it with a tarpaulin as he had been taught. Never leave evidence in plain sight. Never assume you are safe. Never trust that yesterday's hiding place will be secure tomorrow. The safe house occupied the second floor, accessible only through a concealed door behind a false wall. Marcel climbed the narrow stairs, his legs aching from the long ride and the adrenaline crash that followed the operation. At the top, he knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more. The recognition signal. The door opened to reveal Father Dominic, an elderly priest who had been excommunicated by the Vichy Collaborationist Church for refusing to preach obedience to the occupiers. The old man's face creased into a smile when he saw Marcel. "You look like death itself, my son," Father Dominic said, ushering him inside. "But you're alive, which means it went well." "Well enough," Marcel replied, collapsing into a wooden chair. His hands were still shaking, delayed reaction to the violence. "We got the ammunition, lost 3 people, found our traitor." The priest crossed himself and murmured a prayer for the dead. Then he brought Marcel bread, cheese and wine, the sacraments of survival in occupied France. Marcel ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, his mind replaying the night's events in an endless loop. "The Germans will retaliate," Father Dominic said quietly. "They always do. A train full of ammunition doesn't disappear without consequences." Marcel knew this. They had all known it when they planned the operation. The German policy of sooner, collective punishment was well established. For every German killed, they executed dozens of French civilians. For major acts of sabotage, entire villages could be destroyed. The massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane 6 months earlier had proven how far the Germans would go when provoked. "We took precautions," Marcel said, though the words felt hollow. "No witnesses who could identify us. The train crew never saw our faces clearly. Luc is dead, so he can't talk. We covered our tracks." But had they? In the cold light of day, Marcel could see a dozen ways their operation might be traced. A witness they had not noticed. A piece of evidence left at the quarry. One of the volunteer unloaders talking to the wrong person. The resistance lived perpetually on the edge of discovery, one mistake away from the Gestapo's interrogation cells. "Rest now," Father Dominic advised. "You've earned it. Tomorrow's troubles will come whether you worry about them or not." Marcel tried to sleep, but his mind would not quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the young German guard's face as the knife bit into his throat. The boy had probably been 19 or 20, the same age as Marcel. In another world, they might have been friends, might have shared drinks and talked about girls and complained about their fathers. Instead, they had met for 30 seconds in the darkness, and one of them had died. This was what the war had made of them all: killers or corpses, with precious little middle ground. 3 days passed in the safe house. Father Dominic brought news from the city, filtering rumours from facts with the skill of a man who had spent decades listening to confessions and separating truth from self-deception. The Germans were furious about the train, that much was certain. Patrols had doubled. Random searches increased. The Gestapo was questioning railway workers throughout the region. But there had been no mass arrests, no public executions, no burned villages. The Germans were hunting, but they were hunting blind. Whatever Luc had reported before his death, it had not been enough to compromise the operation's security. On the 4th day, a messenger arrived with new papers for Marcel. He was no longer Claude Arnaud, the labourer. Now he was Michel Poirier, a clerk transferring to work in the German administrative offices in Lyon. The identity came with a full backstory, supporting documents, and even a letter of recommendation forged so perfectly that it would pass any inspection. The resistance had become expert forgers. They had to be. Occupied France ran on papers, identity cards, ration books, travel permits, work certificates. The ability to create convincing forgeries was as important as the ability to use weapons. Perhaps more so, since forged papers could get you past checkpoints that bullets could not. "You're being moved to Lyon?" Father Dominic asked, examining the new documents. Marcel nodded. "The network there needs someone with my experience. They're planning something big, something that requires coordination with multiple cells. I leave tomorrow." The priest blessed him and offered communion. Though Marcel had long since stopped believing in God, he accepted anyway, for the ritual, if not the theology. In a world of constant change and danger, ritual provided the illusion of permanence. The next morning, Marcel left the warehouse before dawn. His bicycle had been repainted overnight, transformed from black to blue, with a registration tag from a different region. Even his bicycle had to assume a new identity. He rode south through the autumn countryside, following routes that avoided major checkpoints, stopping at resistance safe houses and courier drops along the way. Lyon, when he reached it 2 days later, was a different world from rural Burgundy. The city throbbed with German military presence. Convoys rumbled through the streets. Soldiers filled the cafes and brothels. The Gestapo headquarters occupied the Hotel Terminus, a beautiful building now synonymous with torture and death. But Lyon was also a centre of resistance. The city's complex geography, with its traboules, hidden passageways connecting buildings, made it ideal for clandestine operations. Multiple resistance networks operated in Lyon, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, always fighting the same enemy. Marcel's contact met him in the basement of a bookshop near Place Bellecour. The man introduced himself as Raymond, though Marcel suspected this was no more his real name than Michel Poirier was Marcel's. Raymond was older, perhaps 40, with the cautious eyes of someone who had survived too many close calls. "Welcome to Lyon," Raymond said without warmth. "I hope you're as good as Paris says you are. We've lost a lot of good people recently. The Gestapo has a new interrogator, Klaus Barbie. They call him the Butcher of Lyon. He's making our lives very difficult." Marcel had heard of Barbie, the SS officer whose creative cruelty had become legendary among resistance circles. Captured fighters were known to commit suicide rather than face his interrogations. "What's the operation?" Marcel asked, cutting through the preliminaries. He was not here to make friends. Raymond spread a map across the table. It showed Lyon and the surrounding region, marked with various symbols. "We're coordinating the largest simultaneous sabotage operation attempted in France. On the same night, at the same hour, resistance cells across 6 departments will strike German targets, fuel depots, railway bridges, communication centres, ammunition dumps. The goal is to create chaos, to force the Germans to spread their resources thin, to demonstrate that the resistance is not isolated cells, but a coordinated force." It was ambitious to the point of recklessness. The level of coordination required was immense, and every additional person involved increased the risk of betrayal or discovery. But Marcel could see the strategic value. The Allies were making progress in Italy. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The invasion of France was coming, perhaps as soon as next spring. The resistance needed to prove it could provide meaningful support when that day arrived. "What's my role?" Marcel asked. "Coordination and execution. You'll work with 3 other cell leaders to hit the rail yards here." Raymond pointed to a location on the map. "It's the main German logistics hub for the entire region. We damage it badly enough, and their supply lines will be disrupted for weeks." Over the following days, Marcel met with the other cell leaders. There was Isabelle Chen, daughter of Chinese immigrants, whose family's restaurant served as a resistance meeting place, and Dead Drop. There was Thomas Keller, an Alsatian who had deserted from the German army and now fought with the fury of a man trying to atone for past sins. And there was Margot Blanc, a former schoolteacher who had watched the Gestapo execute her husband and now lived only for revenge. They were a strange collection, bound together by shared hatred and shared purpose. Planning the operation was like assembling a complex puzzle where each piece had to fit perfectly, or the entire picture would collapse into chaos. Sophie arrived in Lyon 2 weeks after Marcel. He saw her at a resistance meeting in the back room of a laundry, and his heart lifted despite the circumstances. She looked thinner, more worn, but her eyes still held that sharp intelligence he had always admired. They found a private moment in a borrowed apartment overlooking the Saône River. For a few hours they could pretend to be normal people instead of soldiers in an invisible army. "I thought about you every day," Sophie said, lying in his arms as darkness fell over the city. "I kept imagining the Germans had caught you, that I'd hear about your execution on the BBC radio broadcasts." "I'm harder to kill than that," Marcel said, trying to sound confident. In truth, he knew survival was mostly luck. Skill and caution helped, but ultimately whether you lived or died often came down to whether a Gestapo agent happened to look left instead of right. whether an informer happened to see you enter the wrong building, whether one document had a slightly wrong stamp. After the war, Sophie said, repeating the phrase that had become both mantra and prayer among resistance fighters, I want to live somewhere quiet, maybe a farm in Provence, grow lavender and olives, never hear a gunshot again. Marcel wanted to promise her this future, but he had learned not to make promises he could not keep. Instead, he held her tighter and let the silence speak for him. The weeks passed in a blur of planning and preparation. The resistance cells stockpiled explosives, scouted targets, memorized timing sequences, and prepared escape routes. Every detail had to be perfect. There would be no second chance. But as the operation date approached, Marcel began noticing small anomalies. Patrols seemed to be concentrated near their targets. German security around the rail yards increased without apparent reason. Questions at checkpoints became more pointed, more specific. Someone was leaking information. But who? The operation involved dozens of people across multiple cells. The traitor could be anyone. Marcel shared his concerns with Raymond, who dismissed them. You're paranoid because of what happened in Burgundy. Security is tight. We've vetted everyone. But paranoia had kept Marcel alive this long, and he trusted his instincts. He began conducting his own quiet investigation, watching the other resistance members, looking for signs of betrayal. The irony was not lost on him. The fight against the Germans was consuming itself, turning fighters into suspicious shadows, afraid of their own comrades. 3 days before the scheduled operation, the Gestapo struck. They raided Isabel Chen's restaurant at dawn, arresting everyone inside. 17 resistance fighters were captured in a single blow, including Isabel herself. The raids continued throughout the day: safe houses, meeting places, weapons caches. The Germans had detailed intelligence, precise locations, names and faces. The resistance network in Lyon was being systematically destroyed. Marcel and Sophie escaped only because they had been staying in a different location, an apartment Raymond did not know about. They huddled in the darkness, listening to the sound of German vehicles prowling the streets below, searching for more victims. We have to assume everyone's compromised, Sophie said, her voice tight. Raymond, Thomas, Margot, all of them. Either they're captured or they're traitors. Marcel's mind raced through possibilities. The traitor could be anyone, but the pattern of arrests pointed to someone with comprehensive knowledge of the operation. That narrowed the list considerably. We need to warn the other cells, Marcel said. If the operation goes forward now, it's a massacre. The Germans will be waiting. But warning the other cells meant making contact, and any contact could lead the Gestapo right to them. They were trapped in the classic resistance dilemma: act and risk exposure, or hide and watch others walk into a trap. Sophie made the decision. We warn them. That's what we signed up for. We don't let people die just to save ourselves. They spent the night moving through Lyon's traboules, the hidden passageways that had served resistance fighters since medieval times. These narrow corridors, known only to locals, connected buildings in ways that confounded German attempts to seal off neighborhoods. They were Lyon's secret architecture, and now they became escape routes for 2 fugitives racing against time. At each resistance contact point, Marcel and Sophie left coded messages warning of the compromise. Some contacts had already been arrested, others had fled. A few remained, grateful for the warning, and joined the effort to spread the alarm throughout the network. By dawn, they had done what they could. The coordinated operation was cancelled, cells were scattering, and the resistance in Lyon was in full retreat. It would take months to rebuild, if rebuilding was even possible. Marcel and Sophie found temporary refuge in the attic of an abandoned factory. Through a grimy window they could see German soldiers conducting house-to-house searches in the neighborhood below. The Gestapo was being thorough, clearly determined to destroy the resistance network completely. "We can't stay in Lyon," Sophie said. "They'll find us eventually. We need to get out, regroup somewhere else." Marcel agreed, but leaving the city would be nearly impossible. Every road, every train station, every checkpoint would be on high alert. Their papers, no matter how good, might not withstand intensive scrutiny. They were trapped in a city that had become a giant cage. As they watched the searches below, Marcel saw a familiar figure walking with a group of German soldiers. Raymond, the man who had recruited him, who had planned the operation, who had dismissed his security concerns. Raymond was not a prisoner. He walked freely, gesturing and pointing, clearly directing the Germans to resistance locations. The betrayal hit Marcel like a physical blow. How long had Raymond been working for the Germans? Had the entire Lyon network been a German operation from the start? How many resistance fighters had Raymond sent to torture and death? Sophie saw it too. Her hand found Marcel's, squeezing tight. "We're going to kill him," she said quietly. It was not a question or a suggestion, but a simple statement of fact. "First we survive," Marcel replied. "Then we can think about revenge." They waited in the attic for 2 days, existing on rainwater collected in an old bucket and a half-loaf of stale bread Sophie had in her bag. Below, the German searches continued with methodical thoroughness. Several times, soldiers entered the factory building. Marcel and Sophie hid behind old machinery, barely breathing, as boots echoed through the empty spaces below their hiding spot. On the 3rd day, the searches moved to other neighbourhoods. The Germans could not maintain that level of intensity indefinitely. They had to return to regular occupation duties, and that created gaps in their coverage. Marcel and Sophie made their move at dusk, slipping out of the factory and making their way to the Saône River. They had abandoned any thought of using their papers or official channels. The only way out was through stealth and luck. Near the river, they found a small boat tied to a private dock. It was little more than a rowboat, but it was transportation. They stole it without hesitation, rowing downstream through the cold November night. The current did most of the work, carrying them away from Lyon, while they huddled in the bottom of the boat, trying to stay warm and invisible. By dawn, they were 20 kilometers south of the city. They abandoned the boat and began walking through farmland. 2 more refugees in an occupied country full of people displaced by war. Their clothes were dirty, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They looked like 1,000 other desperate people trying to survive. A farmer's wife took pity on them, offering food and a barn to sleep in. She asked no questions, and they offered no explanations. This was occupied France, where ignorance was often the price of survival. The less you knew, the less you could be forced to reveal. Over the following weeks, Marcel and Sophie made their way south toward the Mediterranean coast. The Vichy government controlled the south, and while it collaborated with the Germans, its police force was less efficient, more corruptible than the Gestapo. There was also an escape line through the Pyrenees to Spain, organized by resistance networks to evacuate compromised agents and shot down Allied pilots. The journey was grueling. They walked dozens of kilometers each day, avoiding main roads, sleeping in forests and abandoned buildings, begging for food from farmers who had little enough for themselves. Winter was coming, and the cold bit through their inadequate clothing. Somewhere outside Valence, they encountered a group of Maquis fighters, the rural guerrilla bands who had chosen open resistance over urban subterfuge. These were young men, many of them draft dodgers who had fled to the forests rather than be conscripted for forced labor in Germany. They lived rough, surviving on stolen supplies and local support, conducting hit-and-run raids against German targets. The Maquis leader, who called himself Captain Luc, an unfortunate echo of the traitor from the train operation, offered them shelter and food. His band numbered about 30 fighters, armed with an eclectic mix of weapons: hunting rifles, stolen German guns, homemade explosives, even crossbows for silent killing. "Stay with us," Captain Luke suggested. "We can always use experienced fighters. You've obviously seen action." Marcel was tempted. The Marquis's lifestyle appealed to something primal in him, the desire to fight openly rather than hide in shadows. But he knew the Marquis' life expectancy was measured in months. The Germans were methodically hunting down these rural resistance groups, using collaborationist militia and mobile strike forces to sweep the countryside. "We're heading for Spain," Marcel explained. "The Lyon network is compromised. We need to get to London, report what happened, maybe join the Free French forces." Captain Luke nodded, understanding. "The escape line runs through Le Puy-en-Velay. There's a contact there, a priest named Father Antoine. Tell him Captain Luke sent you. He'll get you on the route to Spain." They stayed with the Marquis for 3 days, helping with camp chores and sharing their experiences. These young men were hungry for information about urban resistance operations, about how the underground networks functioned. Marcel and Sophie taught them what they could: how to forge documents, how to recognize Gestapo agents, how to conduct surveillance without being noticed. On the 3rd night, German forces attacked the camp. They came without warning, encircling the position and opening fire with machine guns and mortars. The camp dissolved into chaos. Marquis's fighters returned fire, but they were outgunned and surrounded. Marcel grabbed Sophie's hand and ran. They crashed through the forest in the darkness, branches whipping their faces, the sound of gunfire and screams echoing behind them. Other fugitives fled in all directions, each seeking their own salvation. They emerged from the forest at dawn, exhausted and disoriented. Behind them, smoke rose from where the Marquis camp had been. Marcel never learned how many survived. Captain Luke was probably dead, along with most of his young fighters. Their brief rebellion ended by German efficiency. The death toll was accumulating, a weight Marcel carried with every step. The young German guard from the train, the 3 resistance fighters killed during the hijacking, the 17 arrested in Lyon, certainly tortured, probably executed by now, the Marquis fighters who had offered them hospitality and paid for it with their lives. How many deaths could be justified in the name of resistance? At what point did the cost exceed any possible benefit? These questions haunted Marcel's dreams and waking hours alike. "We can't think about it," Sophie said when he voiced these doubts. "If we start questioning whether it's worth it, we're already defeated. We fight because the alternative is to accept occupation, to let evil proceed unopposed. That's all the justification we need." But Marcel was no longer certain. He had killed, had seen others killed, had participated in operations that brought German retaliation down on innocent civilians. Was he fighting for France's liberation, or was he simply perpetuating a cycle of violence that served no one? They reached Le Puy-en-Velay in mid-December, half-starved and nearly frozen. The town sat atop volcanic outcroppings, dominated by an ancient cathedral and a huge statue of the Virgin Mary. In other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now it was simply another occupied town, another place where Germans patrolled and French people averted their eyes. Finding Father Antoine proved difficult. The priest was cautious, as anyone operating an escape line had to be. Marcel and Sophie spent 3 days making careful inquiries, leaving coded messages, demonstrating their legitimacy through knowledge only resistance members would possess. Finally, a child approached them in the market square and whispered an address. That evening, they knocked on the door of a small house near the cathedral. Father Antoine opened the door, studied them with wise, sad eyes, and let them inside. "Captain Luke sent you?" the priest asked. "He did, though I suspect he's dead now. The Germans raided his camp." Father Antoine crossed himself. "Too many are dead. This war devours the young and leaves only old men like me to count the cost." He sighed. "But you're here now, and you need to reach Spain. It can be arranged, though you'll have to wait. The crossing is dangerous, especially in winter. The snow in the Pyrenees is already deep." They waited in Le Puy for 3 weeks, staying in a series of safe houses, avoiding German patrols, slowly recovering their strength. Other evaders joined them. A British pilot shot down over Normandy, 2 Jewish children whose parents had been deported to the east, a Belgian resistance fighter fleeing the Gestapo. Christmas came and went, a bitter mockery of celebration in occupied France. The Germans celebrated openly, their parties and singing drifting through the cold night air, while French citizens huddled in the darkness and dreamed of liberation. On New Year's Eve, Father Antoine announced they would cross the next day. The weather window was narrow, but the guide was ready. They would travel south through the Massif Central, then cross into Spain through a remote pass in the Pyrenees. The group assembled before dawn, 9 people heading for Spain and freedom, guided by a Basque smuggler named Xabier, who knew the mountains the way other men knew their own gardens. Xabier was weathered and silent, communicating mostly through gestures, but Father Antoine vouched for him completely. The journey south took a week, moving mostly at night, avoiding German checkpoints through intimate knowledge of back roads and mountain paths. Xabier led them unerringly, never hesitating, never lost. When they needed shelter, he brought them to remote farmhouses where families offered food and warmth without question, part of a network of resistance supporters whose courage received no medals or recognition. The Pyrenees loomed ahead, white-capped and forbidding. On the last night before the crossing, they sheltered in a shepherd's hut high in the foothills. Xabier explained the route in broken French. They would cross at night, moving quickly through a pass he knew. German and Spanish border patrols existed, but the mountains were vast and the patrols were sparse. The real danger was the weather and the terrain. One wrong step, one moment of carelessness, and the mountains would claim them. They began the crossing at midnight, climbing through deep snow by moonlight. The cold was intense, biting through every layer of clothing. The British pilot, weakened by injuries sustained when his plane crashed, struggled from the start. Marcel and Sophie took turns supporting him, practically carrying him across the worst sections. Hours passed in frigid torment. Marcel's feet went numb, then his hands. His lungs burned from the altitude and exertion. Beside him, Sophie stumbled repeatedly, catching herself each time through pure determination. The 2 Jewish children cried silently, tears freezing on their cheeks. Dawn found them strung out across a high ridge, exhausted and vulnerable. Xabier urged them forward. They were close now, almost across. Spain and safety lay just beyond the next ridge. Then they heard dogs barking. German patrol dogs, trained to track fugitives, accompanied by soldiers on skis who could move quickly across the snow. The patrol had picked up their trail, perhaps spotted their tracks in the snow. "Run," Xabier hissed, the first time he had shown any emotion. "Run or die." They ran, stumbling through snow that sometimes reached their waists, exhausted bodies finding reserves of energy fear provided. Behind them, the dogs grew closer, their barking echoing through the mountains. The Belgian resistance fighter stopped, turning back. "Go," he said simply. "I'll slow them down." Before anyone could protest, he was gone, moving back along their trail with a pistol in his hand. Seconds later, gunfire echoed through the mountains. The barking stopped, then resumed, more frenzied. More gunfire, then silence. The Belgian had bought them time with his life. They used it, pushing forward with desperate speed. The ridge ahead grew closer, tantalizingly close. Beyond it was Spain, neutral Spain, where the war could not reach them. Sophie stumbled and fell. Marcel hauled her up, but her ankle was twisted, possibly broken. She tried to walk and collapsed again. "Leave me," she gasped. "You have to go." "Shut up," Marcel said, pulling her arm across his shoulders. "We're both going, or neither of us is." The British pilot took her other arm, and together they half-carried, half-dragged Sophie toward the ridge. The others pulled ahead, the two children moving with surprising speed, fear giving them strength. The ridge was 50 meters away, then 30, then 10. Marcel's muscles screamed, his vision blurred. Each breath felt like inhaling knives, but the ridge was there, so close he could touch it. They crested the ridge and tumbled down the far side into Spain. Behind them, German voices shouted, but no shots came. Even the Germans would not risk creating an international incident by firing into Spain. They had made it. Against all odds, through cold and pursuit and exhaustion, they had escaped occupied France. Marcel collapsed in the snow, Sophie beside him, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously, unable to quite believe they had survived. The British pilot sat nearby, his face grey with exhaustion, but showing a smile. Xavier stood watch, making sure the Germans did not follow, his craggy face showing the faintest hint of satisfaction. The Spanish police picked them up a few hours later, detaining them in a refugee camp, while diplomats negotiated their status. The camp was crowded with escapees from all over Europe, Jews, political refugees, resistance fighters, downed pilots. They were technically prisoners, but they were alive and beyond the Gestapo's reach. Marcel and Sophie spent 6 weeks in the camp before British intelligence arranged their transport to England. They travelled by ship from Barcelona to Gibraltar, then by military transport to London, arriving in late February 1944. London was a revelation. The city bore scars from German bombing, but it was alive, free, defiant. The streets filled with Allied soldiers from a dozen nations. The BBC broadcasts that had sustained them in occupied France originated from studios they could actually visit. Charles de Gaulle's Free French Forces had headquarters where they could enlist, where their experience would be valued rather than forcing them to hide. Marcel and Sophie were debriefed by British intelligence, their knowledge of conditions in occupied France carefully documented. They reported Raymond's betrayal, the destruction of the Lion network, the vulnerability of various resistance operations. Their information would be analysed, cross-referenced with other intelligence, and used to inform future operations. Then came the decision. What to do next? They could remain in London, working for intelligence services. They could join the Free French Forces, training to return to France as part of the invasion everyone knew was coming. Or they could simply rest, try to recover some measure of normalcy before the next phase of the war. Sophie made the decision for both of them. "We're going back," she said firmly. "Not now, not immediately, but when the invasion comes, we're going back. France is our home. We don't sit in safety while others fight for it." Marcel knew she was right. They had not endured everything they had endured just to become spectators. When the liberation came, they would be part of it, would help drive the Germans from French soil, would reclaim the country they had fought so hard to free. They enrolled in the Special Operations Executive Training Program, learning advanced sabotage techniques, wireless operation, covert operations planning. The SOE was preparing agents to parachute back into France ahead of the invasion, to coordinate with resistance networks, to cause maximum chaos behind German lines when the moment came. The training was intense, pushing them to their limits and beyond. But after surviving occupied France, The controlled danger of training exercises felt almost quaint. They had faced real Gestapo agents, real patrol dogs, real execution squads. Simulation could not match that reality. Spring came to England, bringing longer days and gathering armies. The south coast, filled with troops and equipment, the greatest invasion force ever assembled, preparing for the liberation of Europe. Marcel and Sophie could feel it building, the accumulated power of free nations preparing to strike back against tyranny. In early June they received their orders. They would parachute into France near Caen, linking up with local resistance networks to sabotage German communications and transportation routes ahead of the invasion. The exact date was not specified, but everyone knew it was imminent. On the night of June the 5th, 1944, they boarded a bomber aircraft with 3 other agents. The plane lifted into the darkness, heading south toward France. Marcel held Sophie's hand as England disappeared behind them, replaced by the black expanse of the Channel. This was what they had fought for, survived for, endured for. The chance to return home, not as fugitives, but as soldiers in a liberating army. The chance to finish what they had started that night, when they hijacked a German ammunition train using nothing but bicycles and courage. The plane droned through the night. Behind them, across southern England, thousands of aircraft were taking off, carrying paratroopers and bombers toward Normandy. The invasion was beginning, the great gamble that would determine Europe's future. Marcel thought about all that had led to this moment. The young German guard he had killed, the traitor Luke, the 3 resistance fighters who died in the train operation, Isabelle Chen and the 17 fighters arrested in Lyon, Captain Luke and his Maquis band, the Belgian who sacrificed himself in the Pyrenees. An endless roll call of the dead, casualties in a war that demanded everything from everyone. Their sacrifices would have meaning if the invasion succeeded, if France was liberated, if the resistance they had waged proved to be more than futile gestures against an unstoppable force. Everything came down to the next few days, the next few weeks. History was being made, and they were part of it. The red light came on in the aircraft, the signal to prepare. Marcel and Sophie checked their parachutes, their equipment, their weapons. Around them, the other agents did the same, faces tight with concentration. The light turned green. "Go!" the dispatcher shouted. Marcel jumped into the night sky, Sophie right behind him. The parachute deployed with a sharp crack, and suddenly he was floating above occupied France, descending toward a land he had sworn to liberate or die trying. Below he could see fires burning, the initial bombing raids hitting German positions. To the north, the sky was lit with flashes and explosions as the invasion force struck the Normandy beaches. The liberation had begun. Marcel landed in a field, Sophie touching down nearby. They quickly gathered their parachutes, burying them in a hedgerow. Around them, France slept, unaware that this was the night everything would change. They had come full circle, from resistance fighters hiding in shadows to soldiers in an army of liberation. The bicycle had carried them this far, that humble machine that had become the symbol of French resistance. Now they would fight with Allied weapons and Allied support, but the spirit remained the same. Ordinary people refusing to accept occupation, refusing to surrender, refusing to stop fighting for freedom. The war was not over. Many more would die before the final victory. But on this June night in 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Marcel and Sophie knew that liberation was possible, that resistance had meaning, that the sacrifices had not been in vain. They set off through the darkness, heading for their rendezvous with the local resistance network, ready to do their part in the great struggle. Behind them lay years of occupation, suffering, and struggle. Ahead lay an uncertain future, battles yet to be fought, dangers yet to be faced. But they walked forward with purpose and hope, two among thousands who had refused to accept defeat, who had fought back with bicycles and courage and determination. They were the French resistance, and they were coming home.